So we come to the end of Acts chapter 5 and to one of my favorite passages in the book of Acts. We get to meet a Pharisee by the name of Gamaliel. So let's go ahead and begin with verse 33. Well, first of all, what's happened? Just to remind us where we're at in the story. So they healed a lame man. The Sanhedrin brought them in, got a little tap on the hand. Don't preach in this name now. But they not only continued to preach in this name, but they continued to gather followers. They began to do more miraculous things that got great attention. Now the leaders are getting upset. They're getting really disturbed. And they bring in, because these people have charismatic authority, not just official authority. And they bring them in, and they put them in jail overnight. And when they're ready to see them, the angel of the Lord has helped them to escape. They're preaching again. They bring them in, going to give them a harder slap on the wrist this time. A lot of good it'll do them because they're obeying God rather than humanity. And so Peter has just told them, we've got to obey God, not mortals like you guys. You've been outplayed. God's the higher authority. We're going to follow God. And that's where we find ourselves with verse 33. And they, having heard, they were enraged. Now, we didn't hear this language back in chapter 4. This time, when Peter's, he posed the question earlier. You decide whether we should obey God or humanity. But now, he said, we're going to obey God, not humanity. And they were enraged. And they were planning to kill them. You can see that the blood pressure has gone up here. It's a little bit different. Of course, the next incident is going to be Stephen, and he's going to die. So the resistance is ramping up. As it grows, the resistance grows. Verse 34. Now a certain Pharisee, having arisen in the Sanhedrin, Gamaliel by name, a teacher of the law, considered worthy by all the people, he commanded to take the men outside for a little while. Okay, so here is Gamaliel. Who is Gamaliel? Well, Gamaliel is a famous Pharisee from this particular period of history. When you look at the later rabbinic writings like the Mishnah or the Talmud, there are certain kind of really famous Pharisees, and this is one of them, Gamaliel. According to tradition, he's the grandson of the great Hillel. There were two schools of Pharisees, and I'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow in my Patrons Only podcast. Gamaliel was, by tradition, the grandson of Hillel, and Hillel was one of the two great founders of Pharisee schools, School of Hillel and the School of Shammai. And from what we understand, the School of Hillel was a little bit more fatalistic, and we do get a very kind of deterministic sense from Gamaliel in what he's about to say here. And let's hear it, verse 35. And he said to them, men, Israelites, interestingly, the same way that Peter addressed the crowds on the day of Pentecost, men, Israelites, hold fast to yourselves, hold on to your horses, hold on there, grab yourselves, hold fast, hold steady there, horse, upon these men, what you are about to do. Okay, let's stop and think for a minute. A lot of times when people are enraged, they don't stop and think for a minute. Thought, pausing to think, and being really, really angry don't generally go together. But Gamaliel says, hold on a second, let's think this through here. For before these days, Theudas arose. And they would have known, and of course, after the time of Theudas, everybody knew who Theudas was. And we'll talk about Theudas also a little in the Patrons Only podcast tomorrow. Theudas arose in these days, saying to be himself to be something. So it's really easy to say you're the Messiah, a little bit harder to produce on it. What was Theudas saying when he said he was the Messiah? He's saying, I'm the king here to overthrow the Romans. So again, confirms that they thought of the Messiah in more political and military terms, as it were, rather than kind of spiritual God come to earth terms. Okay, so a certain Theudas arose, saying that he was something, whom a number of men were inclined to follow, about 400. So this guy was able to gather about 400 followers. Of course, the Christians in Jerusalem at this time, Acts says, are about 5,000. Who was killed? Okay, I guess he's not the Messiah after all. And all, as many as were persuaded by him, They failed. They were ended, and they became into nothing. So where are the followers of Theudas today? There aren't any followers of Theudas today. By the way, Gamaliel, even though Gamaliel is not a believer, he's making an argument for the validity of the Christ movement. There were plenty of other messianic movements, or there were other messianic movements whose leaders died, and it's gone. Why is it that after Jesus died, the Christ movement continues on to this day, 2,000 years later? Well, I think we have a pretty good answer. It was real. And of course, Jesus rose from the dead, something that nobody said Theudas did. Verse 37, after this arose Judas the Galilean, another figure we know from the writings of Josephus. Both Theudas and Josephus, both Theudas and Judas the Galilean are mentioned by Josephus. After this arose Judas the Galilean. I'll talk about this tomorrow in the Patrons Only podcast. In the days of the inscription of the census, and he carried away people after him, and that man perished. And I hate this. I have a little menu that gets in the way of writing, but I believe what it basically says is, not only did this man perish, and everyone, as many as were persuaded by him, scattered. So another one. Judas the Galilean bites the dust. They're gone. Okay, verse 38. And here's where we get to the punchline. And now I say to you, stay away from these guys. Stay away from these men and leave them alone. Because if this plan and this work, this is what these guys are all about, if it's from humans, if it's from mortals, if it's from men, it will fail. It will perish. It'll go away. But if it's from God, you will not be able to cause them to fail. You will not be able to bring it to an end, lest also you be found God fighters. I like this word, theomachoi, fighters of God, which is, of course, pointless, right? It is completely pointless to fight God. And this statement here is very sobering, because I think it is human nature to stubbornly fight for our default position. A lot of times it's a tradition. Maybe it's something we've grown up with. It's maybe something we formed our identity around. Maybe it's the people we hang out with. And so our natural instinct is to fight for the people we know. People who are sexual assaulters and criminals, a lot of times the people who know them said, well, they never assaulted me, or that person never did anything to me. So we tend to stubbornly fight for what we've grown up with or what we've formed our identity around with. But if you step back and you think about it, the people who are on the opposite side may be doing the same thing. Some of these traditions have to be wrong, right? I can't just happen to be born into the place and the time and the group and the family that had everything just right. There've got to be some things that my tradition is wrong on, or some things that my family's wrong. You know what I mean? Or something that my group is on. And so it's human nature to want to fight for that which I've inherited, for my traditions and my background. But whether or not it's true or not depends on what? Whether or not it's true or not. Doesn't matter whether I would feel bad if it turned out that my tradition was wrong. That really doesn't matter as far as the truth is concerned. Either something is true or it's not. And so Gamaliel, the illustration here of Gamaliel, and interestingly, he's not even a believer, yet Scripture holds him up as a positive example here, that we sometimes need to hit the pause when we're so angry and infuriated over whatever that's coming against my background or my tradition or my kind of comfort zone. Gamaliel tells us to hit the pause button and take a second to think, could I be wrong on this? Because if you keep fighting and God's not on your side, you're not going to win. If God's on your side, then you'll win. By the same token, if the people you're fighting against If God's on their side, then it doesn't matter that they really tick you off. If God's on their side, then they're going to win. You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying that the righteous always win an argument or that the good always prevail. That's not what I'm saying. But remember the king of Israel in the Old Testament, who's trying to get Jehoshaphat to go to war with him. I think it's Ahab. And Jehoshaphat says, don't you have any prophets that say anything different? You brought a bunch of prophets here, but they're just saying what you want to say. Don't you have any prophets who give maybe a different perspective? And Ahab's like, oh yeah, there is this Micaiah guy, this other prophet. But he never tells me what I want to hear. What Ahab wanted to hear was, you're going to go to battle and win. That's not what he wanted to hear. And so Ahab got, he went to war and he lost, right? He dies. And so every once in a while, we need to hit the Gamaliel button and step back and say, okay, I'm really furious at this other side, at this other perspective. But you know what? Let me pause, because if this other perspective is of God, then all the fighting I do in the world is completely pointless because I'm going to lose. And that's basically what Gamaliel says here. Hold off here, because if these guys, if these Jesus followers, if they're not from God, they'll wither away on their own. But if they are from God, you can't beat them no matter how hard you try. By the way, there is Gamaliel, there's a time for Gamaliel and then there's a time to be Joshua. So wisdom is knowing what the times are. There is a time when God wants us to stand up and to fight, I believe. And I'm not talking necessarily about go get your sword, but I mean, there's a time to push back on wrong or on injustice. So I'm not saying we should always just sit back and let God take care of it. But there is a time to do that. And wisdom and discernment is knowing what the times are. Okay, I love this. And they were persuaded by him. That's amazing in and of itself. Because usually when people are this angry, nothing's going to persuade them. That speaks to the weight of Gamaliel. Verse 40. And calling the apostles and having beaten them. So this is a bit of heavier slap. The first corrective was kind of like, don't talk in this name. Now it's don't talk in this name. So they commanded them not to speak in the name of Jesus, and then they released them. Now, how did the apostles react to this? Therefore, they were going rejoicing from the face of the Sanhedrin, because they had to know that death was, a possibility here. And what were they rejoicing about? This is amazing. They were rejoicing that they were deemed worthy on the behalf of the name to suffer dishonor. They considered suffering for Jesus an honor. And of course, we don't necessarily think of suffering for Jesus as an honor because we want to fight for our freedoms and fight for our rights and get what we have coming to us as Christians. We Christians should be free, and we're going to fight to the death for this. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do what is within our power to try to maintain our freedoms. I'm not saying just let somebody run all over you in those things, although there's a time for that. But there is this attitude here that if I'm persecuted as a Christian, that's a great honor. Verse 42, and every day in the temple and from house to house, they were not ceasing teaching and preaching the good news of the Messiah, of the Christ, namely Jesus. Great verses. Love this. And of course, chapter 6 is also very, very stimulating, and some great stuff in Acts chapter 6 coming up. And thus we finish the week, and we finish Acts chapter 5. Okay, if you're watching the video version of this, we might take a moment to look at some of the Greek this week. Participle. This is an aorist. Imperfect here. I think this is an aorist. I need to look up the word. I can look up the word for you if you really want me to. Okay, I'm looking up the word. Don't be pushy. Actually, it is imperfect. So all the letters of the present stem are there, just with an augment and different endings. That's how you tell an imperfect. So, and they were enraged. They were being enraged. So they were planning. So it's not just a spur of the moment thing. It's a continuous something that goes on for a bit here. This is the aorist infinitive, to kill them, and having arisen a certain. Notice if you were watching, the word order jumps around a little. A certain Pharisee in the Sanhedrin, Gamaliel by name, law teacher. Here's one that actually does the etymology. I think is pretty straightforward. Law teacher, worthwhile to all the people. Datives here. He commanded outside a little while the men to make the men go outside. Aorist infinitive. Aping an aorist, direct quote. Feel like my dentist, kind of looking for little things here and there in my teeth. In these men, what you are about to do. Interrogative pronoun, present infinitive. Okay. For before these days, Theudas arose. We'll talk about Theudas tomorrow. This is the present infinitive of eimi, saying to be something himself, reflexive pronoun. Aorist passive, to whom were inclined a number of men, about 400. Relative clause, who was killed, aorist passive. As many as were persuaded, kind of a conditional relative clause, we call that. Aorist passive, aorist, and then, of course, this is Apollomy. You might remember in the book of Revelation, the angel of destruction is called Apollomy, I believe. This is a form of it, the aorist of it, perish. In the middle, it means perish. In the active, it means destroy. And the now. We saw this earlier in Acts, this construction. And now. Now, the Greek edition I have puts this in parentheses. Other versions don't. I'm not sure I like it in parentheses, to be exact here. By putting in parentheses, it suggests that the less you should be found God fighters, theomakoi. It basically says this is the next thought, and that this is parentheses. I'm not sure I like that myself. There were no parentheses in the original Greek, so that's an interpretive mood. Aorist passive, aorist participle, aorist participle. It's a liquid verb, so it doesn't do sigmas. That's internal lengthening, because I believe the word is dero, very short word. Not to speak, present infinitive. Aorist passive again, aorist passive infinitive. And there you have it. So some more of the same in the Greek, although some interesting word order. Well, have a great weekend, or whenever you're watching this.